If you do not submit to our will within the next 24 hours, we will eradicate your species." The voice of Valcor, ambassador of the Imperium, echoed across every human communication network. The words were delivered with the chilling calm of someone who had seen entire civilizations reduced to ashes. Yet, in the tone was something worse than coldness. There was a sense of finality, of inevitability. To the people of Earth, it wasn't just a threat. It was a sentence. Humanity had been in talks with the Imperium for months, negotiations that were supposed to bring peace to a galaxy on the verge of war. The alliance had seemed inevitable. Earth had built its way from a single planet to a thriving galactic presence, but now it seemed all that hard-won progress was about to be obliterated. The message from the Imperium was not an isolated ultimatum. It was the last word in a series of failed discussions that had made one thing painfully clear. Earth was not part of the Imperium's vision for the future, and that, for President Eleanor Drake, was the point of no return. In the command room of the United Earth government, the assembled officers and military leaders sat in tense silence. The faces were grim, but there was no fear. The time for fear had long passed. Drake stood at the head of the room, staring at the screen that displayed Valcor's face. His emotionless gaze bored into her, the arrogance of an empire that had never faced true resistance. She swallowed, her rising fury, but the fire in her eyes burned hot. "I think we've heard enough," she said, her voice cold, measured, but carrying an undertone of something deeper, something that, for the first time, flickered with the steel of finality. The room fell quiet. General Alexander Moore, the leader of Earth's military forces, glanced at her with a mix of respect and apprehension. He had known her long enough to see when she was on the edge of a decision, when her calm diplomatic mask slipped and the sharp, brutal pragmatism of the president emerged. "Madam President," Moore spoke carefully, "the Imperium's ultimatum—" "I've heard it," Drake interrupted. "They want us to submit or they'll wipe us out. We're beyond talks now, General. This is war." She turned to face the others in the room. "I will not give in to threats. We cannot. We will not. The galaxy will learn that humanity is not a species to be dismissed, not one to be erased without consequence." The murmur of agreement spread through the room, but there were no cheers. There was no euphoria, only grim acceptance of what was to come. Captain Zoe Thorne, standing near the back of the room, clenched her fists. Thorne had led Earth's first interstellar strike teams, and if it came to a fight, she was ready. But even she knew this was more than just a battle. It was a test of humanity's survival. Drake turned back to the screen. Valcor's expression hadn't changed. "You misunderstand, President Drake," Valcor said, his voice betraying no emotion. "Your species cannot win. The Imperium has no equal. You will bend the knee. The galaxy will know peace once you submit." A bitter smile curled at the edges of Drake's lips. "Peace? Is that what you call genocide?" The ambassador's eyes flickered with a brief, disdainful moment of silence, as if debating whether to continue the charade. "Your defiance will be your undoing, President. Consider this your final warning." "I've made my decision," Drake said, her voice cutting through the tension in the room. "No more talk. Let the war begin." The words hit harder than any blast from an enemy ship. They were a declaration, a promise, and a warning. For Earth's enemies, it was the last warning they would ever hear. Drake turned to Moore, her face set with determination. "Deploy the fleets. Full mobilization. We'll show them that humanity's strength is not in its submission, but in its will to fight." Moore nodded, his face hardening. "Yes, Madam President." As he moved to send the orders, the room buzzed with a frenzied energy. Humanity was no longer standing on the precipice of war. It had already stepped off the edge. There was no turning back. The fight for survival had begun, and the galaxy would soon know that humanity was a force to be reckoned with. The first shots of war were not fired with the roar of cannons, but with the silence of the stars themselves. For 3 days after President Drake's declaration, the galaxy waited in suspense. It wasn't until the 4th day that the Imperium made its move. Without warning, their fleet emerged from the darkness of the outer system, a massive armada that filled the void between Earth and the rest of the universe. Their goal was clear: decimate humanity before it had a chance to strike back. Earth's response was just as swift, but not without its own share of doubts. General Moore stood before the massive map of the solar system, tracking the movements of the enemy fleet as it neared Earth's orbit. His expression was stoic, but beneath it was a simmering intensity. This was no longer a matter of diplomacy or politics. It was survival. "We've got approximately 3 hours before they enter our orbital defenses range," Moore said, his voice steady but edged with the weight of the situation. "They're moving fast. We need to be ready." The war room buzzed with activity. Officers scrambled to finalize strategies, deploying ships and weapon systems to intercept the approaching Imperium forces. The human fleet, though newly formed, was strong, yet not nearly as vast as the overwhelming force now charging toward them. Drake watched the developments from the command center, her eyes narrowed as the fleet's silhouette grew larger on the holodisplay. "What's the status on our counteroffensive?" she asked, turning toward Captain Zoe Thorne, who stood by the strategic console. "We've activated all major fleet divisions. First and second fleets are in position, with secondary forces on standby. However, their flagship, Dreadspire, is approaching faster than anticipated," Thorne replied, her gaze fixed on the data scrolling across the screen. The Dreadspire was the heart of the Imperium's fleet, a towering warship rumored to be capable of wiping out entire planetary defenses in a matter of minutes. It was the last thing they needed to face right now. "Make sure every ship's prepared for a direct engagement," Drake ordered. She didn't flinch when she said it, but the weight of her voice carried a determination that was impossible to ignore. General Moore's eyes flicked back to her. "You realize this is a gamble, right? We're fighting a force that outnumbers us 10-1. We'll need more than just tactics to win this." Drake locked eyes with Moore, her expression unyielding. "We'll use what we have. Humanity's greatest strength has never been numbers. It's our ingenuity, our ability to adapt. The Imperium may have an army of ships, but they don't have what we do." There was a quiet moment in the room as Moore processed the president's words. Then he gave a single nod. "Understood. Prepare for launch," Drake said. She turned toward the vast window, watching the distant stars blink as the final countdown began. In less than 30 minutes, the human fleet would meet the Imperium head-on. The silence in the war room was deafening, but not out of fear. Out of resolve. The threat had become reality, and there was no room for hesitation. Earth's fate, the fate of billions, rested on this next moment. Outside the Earth's orbit, the human fleet surged forward, a swarm of ships cutting through the void like a steel blade against the black. Captain Zoe Thorne stood at the helm of the Vanguard, a newly commissioned warship that had become the face of humanity's defense. The bridge was alive with activity, but the captain was calm. She had trained for this moment, knew that every ounce of her resolve would be needed to face the enemy. "We're in position," her communications officer reported. "Enemy fleet is in range." Thorne's hands gripped the controls with precision as she issued the command, her voice unwavering. "All units lock on targets and fire on my mark." Around her, the entire fleet prepared to engage. The Vanguard was a heavy hitter, outfitted with the latest weaponry, laser cannons, plasma torpedoes, and shield generators that could withstand the initial barrage. But even with their best technology, the human fleet was still outclassed in numbers and sheer firepower. But humanity had something the Imperium didn't: an unwillingness to back down. "Mark," Thorne barked. The first barrage erupted from the human fleet in a dazzling burst of light. Laser fire lanced out, striking the lead ships of the Imperium's advance party. The resulting explosion was spectacular, but it was only the beginning. A retaliatory wave of fire surged back, and the human fleet had no choice but to brace for impact. The first impact came swiftly. A plasma shell from an Imperium destroyer ripped through the hull of a human frigate, sending it spiraling into space. The void was alive with the chaos of battle, and Thorne's pulse quickened as she watched the destruction unfold. "Captain!" one of her officers shouted over the comms. "We're taking heavy damage on the starboard side!" "Return fire. Don't give them a chance to breathe," Thorne commanded, her voice sharp as ever. Her mind was already processing their next move. They couldn't win on brute force alone. They had to outmaneuver them, force the Imperium into mistakes. "Captain, we've got a direct hit on our shields," the tactical officer warned. "If this keeps up, we'll be sitting ducks." Thorne's gaze flickered to the display of the Imperium. Flagship Dreadspire. It loomed ominously on the horizon, its massive weapon systems beginning to charge. They had only moments before it unleashed its full power. "Not if I can help it," she muttered. She quickly issued an order. "All ships, prepare to go dark. We're going to outsmart them." The human fleet shifted course at an unexpected angle, using the shadows of nearby asteroids to hide their movements. The Imperium fleet, overconfident in their superior technology, pursued blindly into the trap, and humanity's fleet opened fire again, hitting key weak points on the alien ships, but the battle was far from won. As the two forces clashed in a violent storm of fire and metal, one fact became undeniable. Humanity was no longer just trying to survive. They were fighting to prove that they could be a force that no one, not even the Imperium, could simply ignore. The war had truly begun. In the silence after the battle, the price of victory was clearer than ever. Humanity had survived the first wave. But victory, however small, was fleeting. The Imperium's overwhelming numbers had been momentarily outwitted, but Earth's fleet had paid a steep price. Ships burned in the cold emptiness of space, and the echoes of battle had left their mark on every officer in the war room. General Moore stood over the holographic map, his eyes scanning the blinking red dots of Imperium forces still encircling the system. He rubbed a hand over his face, weary but focused. "We've gained a temporary advantage, but it won't last. We can't fight this war with just our strength alone. We need to change the game." Beside him, Captain Zoe Thorne, still processing the intensity of the battle, nodded slowly. "They won't make the same mistake twice. The next wave will be worse." Drake had watched from the command center, her fingers steepled in front of her face. There was no victory dance, no relief. The battle had been won, but the war was far from over. The enemy had more resources, more ships, and more strategies than humanity could match. "Do we have any reinforcements?" she asked, breaking the silence. "Not in time," Moore replied, his voice steady but heavy with the weight of reality. "What we have is what we'll fight with. Earth's defenses are holding, but our fleet is stretched thin. If we're to win, we need something more." Drake's eyes narrowed. "We need an edge, something the Imperium doesn't expect." The room went quiet as Moore considered her words. It was clear what she was implying, an unorthodox solution. "A gamble." "Sir?" Lieutenant Harris, the communications officer, interrupted, her voice sharp with urgency. "We've intercepted a transmission from the Imperium. It's a status report on their forces, something we can use." "Patch it through," Drake ordered. The screen flickered to life, and Valkor's cold, calculating face filled the display once more. His words were clipped, almost mechanical, as he addressed his commanders. "Underestimate the humans at your own peril. They are resilient, but they are weak. We will crush them by the time we reach their homeworld. Continue the assault without delay." The transmission cut off abruptly, but the message was clear. There was no room for negotiation. The Imperium's arrogance had reached new heights. "We have one chance," Moore said, breaking the silence that followed the transmission. If we can find their weakness, something they're not prepared for, we can turn the tide. But we don't have much time. Drake's mind raced. The Imperium was confident, but overconfident. The notion that humanity was weak was a flaw in their thinking. We need to hit them where they least expect it. We need to make them think we have more at our disposal than we actually do. Send them a message then, Moore replied, his eyes flashing with the same determination as Drake's. It's time to stop fighting with our backs against the wall and start taking the fight to them. The strategy was born in that instant. One, that would exploit the one thing the Imperium had underestimated, the unpredictable nature of humanity's survival instinct. Drake turned to Thorne. Prepare a strike force. We're going to take out their supply line. Thorne's eyes narrowed as she processed the plan. You're thinking of hitting their logistics center, the heart of their operations. But that's practically suicide. They've got a fleet protecting it. In the silence after the battle, the price of victory was clearer than ever. If we hit their supply line, they'll have no choice but to commit more ships to defend it. We use that to divide their forces and buy us time. The gamble was clear. Humanity would strike deep within enemy territory, targeting the Imperium's supply hubs. In doing so, they would force the alien empire to reallocate resources, thinning their forces at the front lines. The mission was dangerous, borderline impossible, but it was humanity's only chance to break free of the Imperium's stranglehold. Captain, you're leading the mission, Drake said. Thorne didn't hesitate. Understood. We'll hit them hard. The plan was set into motion within hours. Earth's fleet, battered but not broken, shifted its course toward the Imperium's supply route. The mission was reckless, but in the cold reality of war, it was the only move left. The vanguard led the charge, with Captain Thorne at the helm, flanked by a handful of elite ships, all prepared for the risks. The Imperium fleet wouldn't expect such an audacious move. That was the key. As the human fleet neared their target, the tension was palpable. They were outgunned, outnumbered, and running on fumes. But the soldiers aboard knew what was at stake. Failure wasn't an option. For humanity to stand a chance, they had to prove that they were more than just survivors. They were fighters, and the battle for the galaxy had only just begun. Victory was not a single event. It was the sum of every decision made under fire. The mission had been a success. Against all odds, humanity had struck at the heart of the Imperium's supply chain. Their forces were disrupted, their resources scattered. The ripple effects were immediate. The Imperium had no choice but to pull ships from the front lines to defend their failing infrastructure. The balance of power had begun to shift. Captain Zoe Thorne stood on the bridge of the Vanguard, staring out at the debris of the Imperium's shattered supply base. The mission had been risky, a calculated gamble, but it had paid off. The human fleet, though smaller and less experienced, had inflicted damage where it mattered most. It was the first true blow to the Imperium's superiority, and it sent a message that the galaxy would hear. "We've got incoming," the tactical officer, Lieutenant Harris, called from across the room. "New fleet readings, Imperium ships, but fewer than expected. They're pulling back from the front." "Get us into position," Thorne commanded, her voice calm but filled with purpose. "We hit them now, before they regroup." The Vanguard moved swiftly, its sleek form cutting through the void, flanked by a dozen smaller human vessels, all battle-worn but eager for the fight. For the first time since the war began, the Imperium fleet seemed uncertain. The humans were no longer just a threat to be brushed aside. They were a challenge. Back in Earth's war room, President Drake watched the battle unfold on the main display. The loss of the supply base had rattled the Imperium's confidence, but it wasn't just that. There was a shift in the air, something more intangible. For the first time, humanity wasn't just reacting to the Imperium. They were dictating the pace of the war. General Moore, Drake said, turning to her chief military officer. "What are we looking at?" Moore's eyes flicked over the data. "Their fleet is in disarray. They've pulled back a few ships, but they've left key positions exposed. This could be our window to push." Drake's mind raced. Every move counted now. "Send the message to all fleet commanders. We push forward. Hard." It was a risky strategy. The Imperium might be pulling back, but they were still the more powerful force. This could be a trap, an attempt to lure humanity into a vulnerable position. But Drake knew there was no turning back now. The Imperium had been underestimating humanity from the beginning. It was time to show them just how wrong they were. The battle began before the human fleet had even fully arrived. The remaining Imperium forces attempted to regroup, but their formation was a mess, frantic and defensive. The human ships exploited the gap, launching their attack with precision. "We've got their flank," Thorne reported, her voice steady, almost detached as the battle unfolded. "Focus fire on their command ships." The vanguard tore into the Imperium's rear guard, the ship's plasma cannons lighting up the void as they carved through enemy shields. The Imperium was scrambling to adjust, their ships scattering as they attempted to re-establish their defensive positions. "We've got a break in their lines," Harris called out. "This is it, Captain. Full assault now." Thorne didn't hesitate. "All ships, engage at maximum speed. Take out their command structure. Leave them in disarray." The fleet surged forward, weapons firing, a synchronized symphony of destruction. The Imperium was a well-oiled machine, until now. The humans' audacity, their ability to adapt and exploit weaknesses, was something the Imperium hadn't accounted for. In the chaos, Thorne's mind was focused. She knew the risk, they were still outnumbered, but the chance to land a devastating blow was too great to ignore. As her fleet tore into the heart of the Imperium's forces, she couldn't help but feel the surge of something she hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. Back on Earth, Drake watched as the battle raged. Humanity wasn't just surviving, they were beginning to dominate the battlefield. The Imperium's superior technology and numbers were being overrun by a new kind of warfare, one built on speed, surprise, and ingenuity. The message was clear. Humanity was no longer a weak, struggling species. They were a force. The battle continued for hours, each moment a fierce exchange of energy, strategy, and desperation. By the time the dust settled, the Imperium's rear guard had been crippled. Several command ships lay in ruins, and the remaining enemy fleet was retreating, but not without leaving a heavy toll on the human forces. As the vanguard limped back to Earth's orbit, its hull scarred but still intact, Captain Thorne let out a long breath. They had pushed the Imperium back, yes, but at what cost? The human fleet was damaged, several ships were lost, and the wounded were many. "We did it, Captain," Lieutenant Harris said, her voice filled with awe. Thorne nodded, her face solemn. "We've made them bleed, but we're not done yet." Back in the war room, President Drake stood tall, watching the results unfold on the screen before her. The Imperium's retreat was a victory, but it was only the beginning. The enemy was wounded, but they weren't defeated. Yet for the first time, humanity had taken control. The tide had turned. The Imperium had been forced to react, and the next time they faced humanity, they would know better than to assume that victory was inevitable. The war was far from over, but now, humanity had the upper hand. Victory always carries a price, one that must be paid in blood and broken lives. The aftershocks of the human fleet's victory were felt across the galaxy. The Imperium had retreated, wounded but not defeated, and the momentum had shifted in humanity's favor. Yet, as the celebrations rang out on Earth, a far quieter truth lingered in the shadows. The cost of the war was beginning to show. General. Moore stood in the dimly lit command room, staring at the holographic map of Earth's defense lines. The Imperium was no longer an unstoppable force. They were a wounded animal, lashing out in their desperation. The human fleet had won critical battles, but the losses were mounting. He felt the weight of every decision pressing on his shoulders. "General, report from the front," Lieutenant Harris said, her voice tight with fatigue. "We've lost. Another cruiser. Odyssey was hit during the last skirmish. No survivors." Moore didn't react immediately. Instead, he ran a hand through his hair, his mind already calculating the consequences. The Odyssey was one of the fleet's newer ships, a shining example of human engineering. Now it was nothing more than debris floating in the void. "How many?" Moore asked, his voice hoarse. 300 dead, Harris replied, eyes scanning the report. The crew was still in the process of evacuating, but the blast, it didn't give them a chance. Moore took a deep breath. This wasn't a war of simple tactics anymore. It was a war of attrition, and humanity was beginning to feel it. They had no choice but to keep pushing forward, but every victory came with a sacrifice. How long could they sustain this? On Earth's surface, President Drake stood before a council of military and political leaders, the strain of endless war evident on her face. The war had taken its toll on her, too. Her once pristine suit now carried the subtle wear of sleepless nights and mounting pressure. "General Moore's report is troubling," Drake said, her voice steady but with an edge of concern. "The Imperium is retreating, yes, but they've regrouped and are preparing for something larger. We can't afford to rest on our laurels." The room fell silent as the full weight of the situation sank in. The truth was undeniable. Humanity's resistance had been fierce, but it was not without consequences. The Imperium was relentless and Earth's forces were stretched thin. "What's the status on our reinforcements?" one of the council members asked. "We're pulling every available ship from Earth's orbit, but it's not enough," Moore said, his tone grim. "Our forces are running low on supplies, and our fleet's morale is weakening. We need more time to regroup. But time is something we're running out of." Drake's mind raced, her fingers tapping against the table in thought. There had to be a solution, something that would allow them to continue the fight. The lives of millions, maybe billions, depended on it. But what? "We cannot afford a protracted war," she said finally, her voice cutting through the tension. "We need a decisive strike, a blow that will shatter the Imperium's confidence." Captain Thorne was no stranger to loss. Her role in the war had forced her to witness the destruction of countless ships and the deaths of friends and comrades alike. Yet the latest report from the front hit harder than any before it. The Odyssey had been her responsibility. She had personally overseen its launch, and now it was gone, leaving nothing but silence in its wake. The Vanguard was still operational, but for how long? Her officers were tired, the crew worn thin from battle after battle. The fleet might have the upper hand now, but it wouldn't hold unless something changed. Sitting alone in her quarters, Thorne stared out at the stars, the cold, endless void stretching before her. She thought about the families of the fallen, the children who would never see their parents again. It was a bitter thought, and one that gnawed at her insides. "War is a thing of pain," she muttered under her breath. She had once believed in the cause, believed that humanity's survival was worth any price. But now, as the bodies piled up, she wondered if they would ever truly be free of this cycle. Back in the war room, Moore stood before the strategic table, his fingers hovering over the keys. The human fleet was ready for another offensive, but the question was no longer whether they could win. It was whether they could survive long enough to turn the tide for good. "General, President Drake's orders are clear," one of his officers said. "We strike now, or we risk losing everything." Moore's eyes darkened. The decision had been made. It wasn't about winning anymore. It was about survival. "Prepare the fleet for the offensive," he said, his voice hard. "Tell them to remember why we fight." As the fleet assembled, the reality of the situation began to sink in. Every ship, every soldier, every life would be a calculated sacrifice. The cost of war was no longer abstract. It was personal. And for those left standing, the fight had become more than just survival. It had become a testament to everything humanity stood for. But as humanity prepared to strike, President Drake stood at the precipice of an even greater choice, one that would determine whether Earth would remain a fledgling power in the galaxy or rise to become a force that could never be ignored again. The price was steep, but it was a price humanity had to pay if they wanted to secure their place in the stars. Every war has its breaking point, the moment when victory or defeat is decided in the heat of battle. The human fleet, battered and bruised, had reached its final line. The last few months had been a blur of relentless conflict, each battle harder than the last. The Imperium was reassembling its forces, gathering every ship, every weapon it had left for one final assault on Earth. And humanity, standing at the edge of survival, had no choice but to meet them head-on. General Moore stood on the command deck, the room tense with anticipation. Every officer, every crew member was well aware of the stakes. This wasn't just another skirmish. It was the culmination of everything they had fought for. If humanity didn't win here, the Imperium would crush them completely. "We're looking at their full force, General," Lieutenant Harris said, her voice low. "All their ships, every fleet division, they're coming in full force." Moore nodded, his jaw set. "Then we give them everything we've got. We hold Earth at all costs." Back on Earth's surface, President Drake watched the situation unfold from the war room. She had made countless decisions over the course of the war, but this one felt different. There was no more room for hesitation, no more second chances. The next few hours would decide the future of the human race. "We've mobilized everything," Moore said, joining her. "Every ship, every fighter. It's all in play now." Drake stared at the holographic map of the battlefield where the looming threat of the Imperium fleet was fast approaching. "This is it. No more retreat, no more diplomacy. We fight for our survival." The room fell silent. Everyone knew what was at stake. In space, Captain Zoe Thorne stood at the helm of the Vanguard, the ship that had led humanity's charge from the beginning. Her crew was exhausted, their faces drawn from endless hours of combat. Yet, there was no fear, only determination. "Captain, the Imperium fleet is within firing range," Harris reported from the tactical station. "They're powering up their weapons." "Prepare for battle," Thorne ordered. She gripped the command chair, her gaze fixed on the stars beyond. This would be their toughest fight yet. The Vanguard and its accompanying ships moved into position, the human fleet forming a defensive line around Earth, ready for the inevitable assault. The tension was unbearable. Every second felt like an eternity as the two forces prepared to clash. The Imperium's ships were massive, their weaponry deadly, but humanity had one advantage, the element of surprise. The Imperium believed they were facing a desperate, outmatched foe. What they didn't know was that humanity had learned how to fight smarter, not just harder. "Engage," Thorne said, her voice cold with resolve. The battle erupted in a fiery storm of energy. Lasers streaked across the sky, ships exploded in blinding flashes, and the vastness of space seemed to tremble under the fury of the conflict. The Vanguard surged forward, cutting through enemy lines with calculated precision. The human ships weren't as large, but they were agile, and they knew how to exploit the smallest weaknesses. "We've got an opening," Thorne shouted. "Focus fire on their flagship." The Dreadspire, the Imperium's pride, hung in the distance like a dark omen. It was the largest and most powerful ship in their fleet, the center of their command structure. If humanity could bring it down, they could shatter the Imperium's resolve. The Vanguard led the charge, its weapons blazing as it raced toward the enemy flagship. The Imperium responded with fury, but the human fleet held firm, every ship fighting with a desperation born from knowing what was at stake. On Earth, Drake watched the battle unfold, her mind focused and clear despite the overwhelming pressure. "Report," she ordered, her voice unwavering. "The Vanguard is closing in on the Dreadspire," Moore said. "If they can land a critical hit, we might have a shot at victory." Drake's heart pounded as the tension reached its peak. The battle was reaching its climax. She knew that victory would require a sacrifice. There would be no easy way out. The Vanguard closed in on the Dreadspire, and in one final desperate push, Thorne ordered a full assault. The ship's forward shields flared as enemy fire hammered it from all sides. But the Vanguard pressed forward, undeterred. "We're almost there," Thorne said, sweat beading on her forehead. "All systems, push them to maximum." With a final, decisive strike, the Vanguard fired a concentrated blast directly at the Dreadspire's core. The impact was catastrophic. The flagship erupted in a fiery explosion, a massive shockwave rippling through the space around it. For a moment, everything went still. Then, the Imperium fleet, once so sure of its superiority, began to crumble. Their flagship was gone. Their command structure shattered. The remaining ships, disorganized and panicked, began retreating. Humanity had done it. They had won. In the war room, Drake allowed herself a brief breath. The fight was over, and humanity had emerged victorious. But even in the triumph, there was a deep, gnawing truth. The cost had been immense. The lives lost, the sacrifices made, those would never be forgotten. The Imperium had been defeated, but the war had taken everything from them. Humanity was now free to chart its own course in the galaxy. And though they had won, the echoes of this victory would reverberate through the stars for generations to come.